The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered asphalt of Riverside High School as Marcus Wellington pulled his midnight blue Dodge Charger into the packed parking lot. The building stood like a monument to small-town Texas pride, faded. Red brick walls telling stories of decades past, American flags dancing in the gentle breeze above the main entrance. Clusters of teenagers gathered near the gymnasium doors, their nervous energy electric in the warm air. But Marcus wasn't focused on the architecture or the crowd. His mind was elsewhere, traveling through corridors of memory that led back to a promise he'd made 2 years ago at a hospital bedside, holding the hand of the woman who'd given him everything worth fighting for. "Promise me you won't miss it," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible above the steady beep of machines. "Promise me you'll be there when Jordan walks across that stage." "I promise, Sarah," he'd replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." Welcome to the Black Side Stories. Before we continue, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, subscribe to our channel and help us share their stories. Now, stepping out of the Charger in his pristine marine dress blues, Marcus Wellington was a man keeping his word. Every crease in his uniform was razor sharp, every ribbon and medal positioned with military precision. His boots gleamed like black mirrors, reflecting not vanity but discipline, the kind that's forged in fire and tempered by loss. He's 6'2", with shoulders that had carried more than their share of burdens. Marcus moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd learned long ago that confidence didn't need to announce itself. His dark skin bore the weathered look of someone who'd seen the world from angles most people never would, and his eyes, deep brown and steady, held the quiet intensity of a warrior who traded his battlefield for a different kind of fight. Raising a son alone, the walk from the parking lot to the school entrance felt like a pilgrimage. Each step carried the weight of 8 hours on the road from Fort Hood, where Marcus served as a master gunnery sergeant. He could have made the journey in a fraction of the time, but Sarah's Charger had been their vessel for so many family adventures. Even 2 years after her passing, he still felt closest to her memory on these Texas highways, with the radio playing softly and her favorite air freshener, vanilla and lavender, still hanging from the rearview mirror. Marcus had enlisted 18 years ago, fresh out of high school himself, driven by a combination of patriotism and the desperate need to build something better than the poverty he'd known growing up in East Dallas. The Marines had given him structure, purpose, and eventually, a family of brothers forged in the crucible of combat. But more than that, military service had given him Sarah they'd met at a USO event in San Antonio when he was on leave between deployments. She was volunteering, serving coffee and sandwiches to homesick soldiers, her smile bright enough to cut through the loneliness that followed him like a shadow. 3 months later, she was writing him letters that kept him anchored during the darkest nights in Afghanistan. 2 years after that, she was walking down the aisle in a simple white dress, promising to love him through deployments, through nightmares, through whatever battles lay ahead. Jordan had arrived 3 years into their marriage, during a brief window when Marcus was stateside, training new recruits at Paris Island. He remembered holding his son for the first time, still in uniform. After a 14-hour shift, dirt still caked under his fingernails from the training course. The baby had stopped crying the moment Marcus took him in his arms, as if he recognized something in his father's touch, strength tempered by gentleness, protection wrapped in love. "He's going to be just like you," Sarah had whispered from the hospital bed, exhausted but radiant. "God, I hope not," Marcus had replied, though he was smiling. "I hope he's better." Now, 18 years later, that baby was about to graduate valedictorian of his class, bound for Texas A&M on a full academic scholarship. Marcus had missed some things, too many school plays, a few parent-teacher conferences, one particularly important birthday when he was deployed to Syria. But he'd never missed the big moments. And this was the biggest of all. Entering the school, building tension, the gymnasium was already buzzing with anticipation when Marcus arrived. Folding chairs arranged in perfect rows filled the main floor, while bleachers packed with families rose toward the rafters. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers, someone's homemade perfume, and that unique combination of excitement and nervousness that only comes with milestone moments. Marcus showed his printed ticket to a volunteer. At the entrance, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a clipboard covered in highlighter marks. She glanced at the ticket, then at his uniform, and her expression softened. "Thank you for your service, young man," she said quietly. "You're in section 3, row C. That's family seating up front." "Much obliged, ma'am," Marcus replied, his Texas drawl more pronounced when he was being polite. The walk to his seat was a journey through a sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Some people nodded respectfully when they saw his uniform. Others did that thing he'd grown accustomed to over the years, the quick glance, the moment of recognition, the subtle shift in posture that said they were trying to figure out whether he belonged there or not. Marcus had been black, tall, and in uniform for 20 years. He knew the difference between curiosity and suspicion, between respect and resentment. Today, most of what he felt from the crowd was the former, but he remained alert to the possibility of the latter. Old habits from old battles that he found his seat in the third row, a plastic chair that wobbled slightly when he sat down. The stage was set beautifully, banners proclaiming Class of 2024 in silver and gold, podium. Positioned just so, rows of Honor Society members already seated in the front section. Marcus scanned the graduates lined up along the far wall until he found Jordan, tall and lanky like his father, with Sarah's gentle eyes and that same quiet confidence that had always made Marcus proud. As Marcus settled into his seat, his mind drifted back 15 years to a dusty valley in Kandahar province, Afghanistan. It was late afternoon, the kind of brutal desert heat that turned the air into something you had to fight to breathe. Marcus, then a gunnery sergeant, was leading a convoy patrol when everything went sideways in the span of 30 seconds. The IED had been buried deep, professionally placed, designed to flip their lead Humvee. Like a child's toy, Marcus remembered the sound, not just the explosion, but the terrible silence that followed, broken only by the hiss of steam from a cracked radiator and the distant crack of sniper fire beginning to rain down from the ridgeline. Point 6. Men were trapped in the wreckage. 6 of his men, Blake Harrison had been the first one Marcus reached, crawling through smoke and debris with a bullet wound in his thigh and another Marine unconscious across his lap. Blake was new to the unit, only 3 months in country, but he'd already proven himself to be steady under fire. "Gunny, I'm good, Blake had insisted, even as blood soaked through his desert camouflage. "Get Soto first, he's hit worse." But Marcus could see the pain in Blake's eyes, the way his hands shook as he tried to maintain pressure on his wounded leg. This wasn't about triage. This was about a young Marine trying to be tougher than his circumstances. "We're all getting out," Marcus had told him, firmly. "That's not a request, that's a promise." The next few minutes had been a masterclass in battlefield leadership. Marcus coordinated the extraction while under constant enemy fire, moving like a man possessed by the absolute certainty that failure wasn't an option. He'd pulled Carlos Rivera from under twisted metal, carried Samuel Brooks across 50 yards of open ground while bullets sparked off rocks around them, and personally dragged Miguel Santos to safety when the young corpsman's leg gave out. But it was Blake Harrison who'd stayed with him until the very end, refusing evacuation until every other Marine was accounted for. They'd held the perimeter together for 47 minutes until air support arrived, sharing ammunition, sharing water, sharing the kind of unspoken understanding that only comes when death is breathing down your neck, and the only thing standing between you and the darkness is the man next to you. After the dust settled and the medevac choppers had taken the wounded to safety, Marcus and Blake had sat in the shade of a damaged Humvee, neither man speaking for a long time. Finally, Blake had looked at him and said, "If you ever need anything, anywhere, anytime, you call me." "Same goes." Marcus had replied. It wasn't a conversation they'd ever had to have again. From that day forward, it was simply understood they were more than fellow Marines. They were brothers. Back in the gymnasium, the ceremony was beginning with all the pomp and circumstance that high school graduations require. The national anthem played, hands over hearts, voices raised in familiar harmony. Marcus stood at attention, his bearing so crisp and military that several people in nearby rows found themselves straightening their own posture unconsciously. As the anthem's final notes faded and the crowd began to settle back into their seats, Marcus noticed two men in security uniforms making their way down the side aisle. They moved with purpose, but not the kind of purpose that suggested they were helping someone find a lost child or directing traffic flow. This was different, more focused, more deliberate. The shorter of the two guards was built like a bulldog, compact, muscular, with a shaved head and the kind of tight expression that suggested he was perpetually annoyed about something. His uniform shirt stretched across his chest, and his utility belt carried the standard security equipment: radio, flashlight, keys, and what looked like pepper spray. His partner was taller, younger, with the lanky build of someone who'd probably played basketball in high school but hadn't kept up with the conditioning. He was chewing gum with the mechanical rhythm of nervous energy, his eyes scanning the crowd like he was looking for trouble rather than trying to prevent it. Marcus tracked their movement peripherally, the way he'd learned to do in places where situational awareness was the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. When they stopped directly beside his row and the shorter guard leaned down to speak to him, Marcus wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting this conversation from the moment they'd started walking in his direction. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, his voice carrying the artificial authority of someone who'd been given a badge and told he mattered. "We're going to need you to come with us." Marcus turned his head slowly, deliberately, meeting the man's eyes, with the kind of steady gaze that had stared down Taliban fighters and Iraqi insurgents. "Is there a problem, officer?" The word officer hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus knew exactly what kind of authority these men had, and it wasn't the kind that demanded that particular form of address. But he also knew that sometimes you had to let people reveal themselves before you decided how to respond. The taller guard stepped forward, his gum chewing becoming more pronounced. "Yeah, this section's for families of graduating seniors. We've been told it's full." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, producing the same printed ticket he'd shown at the entrance. He held it up so both guards could see it clearly. "This is my seat. Third row, section C. Family seating, confirmed and paid for." The shorter guard, his name tag read Patterson, didn't even glance at the ticket. "We've got orders that this section is at capacity. There's some good seats available in the back." And there it was, the thing Marcus had been waiting for, the moment when politeness and procedure gave way to something uglier and more honest. He'd heard variations of this conversation before, in restaurants where he'd been told there was a wait despite empty tables, in stores where he'd been followed by overly attentive security, in a dozen different situations where his presence had been deemed somehow inappropriate by people who'd never bothered to learn his name. "I drove 8 hours to watch my son graduate," Marcus said, his voice quiet, but carrying the kind of steel that made smart people pay attention. "I'll be sitting right here." The gymnasium had that peculiar quality that large spaces get when something uncomfortable is happening. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they got quieter, and people's attention started to drift from the stage toward the brewing confrontation in the third row. Patterson, the shorter guard, straightened up and looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the growing audience, but unwilling to back down. His hand moved to the radio clipped to his belt, and he spoke into it quietly, never breaking eye contact with Marcus. "Control, this is Patterson in the gym. We've got a situation in Section 3 that might need additional support." The response was too quiet for Marcus to hear, but whatever was said made Patterson's jaw tighten. He leaned down again, closer this time, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a threatening whisper. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to move to the designated seating area. This doesn't have to become a problem." Marcus looked at him with the kind of calm that comes from having stared down actual threats in actual combat zones. "Son, you can ask all day. I'm not moving." That's when Officer Davis, the taller guard, made his first real mistake. He stepped forward, positioning himself so that he was partially blocking Marcus's view of the stage, and said the words that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. "Look, maybe you'd be more comfortable in the back section. That's all we're saying." The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. More comfortable. Not better seating, not closer to the exit, not any of the dozen legitimate reasons. Someone might be asked to relocate. More comfortable. As if Marcus's comfort was somehow dependent on being separated from the families around him. as if his presence was making others uncomfortable and needed to be managed accordingly. Marcus had heard that phrase before, and he knew exactly what it meant. He also knew that this was the moment when silence would speak louder than any argument he could make, but he wasn't alone. He never had been. Blake Harrison had been sitting in the back section of the gymnasium, partially hidden behind a family with balloons and poster boards, when he noticed the commotion developing near the front. He'd arrived 20 minutes earlier, having driven down from Dallas where he now worked as a contractor for the Department of Defense. He hadn't announced his presence to Marcus. This was Jordan's day, and Blake didn't want to create any distractions. But when he saw two security guards hovering over his former gunnery sergeant, when he saw Marcus sitting with that particular kind of stillness that meant trouble was brewing, Blake felt something shift inside his chest. The same instincts that had kept him alive in Kandahar kicked in, and he stood up without consciously deciding to do so. He wasn't the only one. Carlos Rivera had been sitting along the right side of the gymnasium, scrolling through his phone while waiting for the ceremony to begin in earnest. Carlos ran a successful construction business in Houston now, but he'd never forgotten the man who'd carried him out of a burning Humvee when shrapnel had torn through his shoulder and chest. When he saw Blake stand up and focus his attention on the front section, Carlos followed his gaze and immediately understood what was happening. Samuel Brooks was positioned near the main entrance. Having arrived late after getting caught in traffic on I-35, he'd served 2 tours with Marcus in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, and was now a police detective in San Antonio. His trained eye picked up on the developing situation even before he spotted his old squad leader in the 3rd row. When he saw Blake and Carlos both standing, both focused on the same point, Samuel felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with the unspoken call to action. Within 30 seconds, 6 men were on their feet in different parts of the gymnasium. They didn't coordinate their movement, didn't signal to each other, didn't need to discuss strategy or tactics. They simply recognized a situation where one of their own needed backup, and they responded the way they'd been trained to respond. As a unit, Marcus felt the shift in the room's energy before he saw the movement. It was subtle at first, like the change in air pressure before a storm, but it grew stronger as more people began to notice that something significant was happening. The guards felt it too. Patterson glanced around nervously, clearly realizing that the dynamic had changed in ways he didn't understand. Is there a reason this man is being bothered? The voice came from Blake Harrison, who had moved to the center aisle and was now standing about 10 feet away from the confrontation. His tone was conversational, almost casual, but there was an undertone of authority that made both guards turn to look at him. Blake was dressed in a simple black suit and white shirt, no tie, no military decorations visible. But everything about his posture, his bearing, the way he held his hands loosely at his sides while keeping his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, announced that he was someone who knew how to handle himself in difficult situations. "Sir, this is a private matter between security and this gentleman," Patterson replied, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "No," Blake said simply. "It's not." The gymnasium had gone quiet now in the way that only happens when everyone instinctively realizes they're witnessing something important. Even the graduates lined up along the far wall had stopped their nervous chatter and were watching the scene unfold. Davis, the taller guard, stepped toward Blake with what he probably thought was an intimidating posture. "And who exactly are you?" Blake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took one measured step forward, just enough to close the distance between them without appearing aggressive. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that comes from having commanded men in life-or-death situations. "I'm the man who's telling you this ends right now." That's when Carlos Rivera stood up from his position along the side wall. Then Samuel Brooks near the entrance. Then Miguel Santos, who'd been sitting with his own family in the middle section. Then David Chun, who'd flown in from Phoenix specifically for this ceremony, though none of them had known the others would be here. 6 Navy SEALs and Marines, spread throughout the gymnasium, all focused on the same point of tension. They didn't move in formation, didn't create a scene, didn't even acknowledge each other directly. They simply stood up and made their presence known, the way they'd done countless times in foreign countries when diplomatic situations required a show of force without an overt threat. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Conversation stopped entirely now. Parents pulled out their phones, some to record, others to call school administrators. Teachers began moving toward the situation. The principal, a middle-aged woman who'd been checking her notes at the podium, finally noticed that her graduation ceremony had been hijacked by something she didn't understand. Patterson looked around the room, clearly realizing that he'd stepped into something much bigger than a simple seating dispute. His hand moved toward his radio again, but Blake's voice stopped him. "Before you make that call," Blake said, still conversational, but with an edge that suggested the conversation was approaching a point of no return, "you might want to consider whether this is really how you want this to go. Are you threatening me?" Patterson demanded, but his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I'm giving you an opportunity," Blake replied. "An opportunity to walk away from a situation that's about to become much more complicated than you're prepared to handle." Marcus, who had remained seated throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but in the now silent gymnasium it carried to every corner of the room. "I came here to watch my son graduate. That's all I came here to do. I'm not looking for trouble, I'm not trying to make a statement, and I'm not going anywhere. If that's a problem for you, then you need to figure out why." The weight of those words settled over the room like a blanket. Here was a man in military dress uniform, clearly a decorated veteran, being asked to move from his assigned seat for reasons that no one could quite articulate, but everyone could clearly understand. And here were 6 other men, obviously his brothers in service, quietly making it clear that whatever happened next would happen to all of them together. The principal, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, finally reached the scene. She was a veteran educator who'd spent 15 years dealing with everything from budget crises to active shooter drills, but she'd never encountered anything quite like this. The tension in the room was palpable, and she could see that whatever was happening had the potential to either explode into something ugly or resolve into something profound. She approached Patterson and Davis first, speaking in the kind of low, urgent tone that school administrators use when they need to end a situation quickly and quietly. "Gentlemen, I need you to step back now." Patterson started to protest. "Ma'am, we were told that." "I don't care what you were told," Dr. Martinez interrupted. "This is my school. This is my graduation ceremony, and I'm telling you to step back." She turned to Marcus, and her entire demeanor changed. Her voice softened, and she extended her hand in a gesture of respect rather than authority. "Sir, I am deeply sorry for this disruption. You are absolutely welcome here, and I want to personally ensure that you're able to enjoy your son's graduation in peace." Marcus stood and shook her hand. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that." Dr. Martinez then did something that surprised everyone, including Marcus. She turned to address the entire gymnasium, speaking into the portable microphone that one of her assistants had quickly provided. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something important. Today we're celebrating our graduating class, young men and women who are about to take their next steps into the world. But we're also in the presence of veterans who have served our country with honor and distinction." She gestured toward Marcus, who remained standing beside his chair. "This gentleman has every right to be here, celebrating his son's achievement, just like every other proud parent in this room. The fact that we needed to have this conversation at all is something we should all reflect on." The applause started slowly, with Blake Harrison clapping deliberately from his position in the center aisle. Then Carlos joined in, then Samuel, then the 6 other veterans scattered throughout the room. Within seconds, the entire gymnasium was applauding, not just polite ceremony applause, but the kind of sustained, heartfelt recognition that comes when people realize they've witnessed something that matters. Marcus nodded once to Dr. Martinez, once to Blake, and sat back down. The guards, clearly understanding that their presence was no longer welcome or necessary, quietly made their way toward the exit. The crisis had passed, but its impact would resonate long after the last diploma was awarded. The ceremony resumed with a different energy now. There was still excitement about graduation, still pride in the accomplishments of the class of 2024, but there was something else as well, a heightened awareness of what it means to stand up for what's right, and what it looks like when people do it with dignity and strength. Jordan Wellington had watched the entire confrontation from his position in the graduating class lineup. He'd seen his father sit with that familiar composure, the same expression Jordan remembered from every difficult moment in their life together. He'd seen the security guards approach with their misplaced authority. And he'd seen 6 men, strangers to Jordan but clearly not strangers to his father, rise from their seats without fanfare, without drama, simply to make it clear that Marcus Wellington would not stand alone. As the ceremony progressed and names were called in alphabetical order, Jordan found himself thinking about all the things his father had never told him about his military service. He'd grown up knowing that Dad was a Marine, knowing that he'd served in Afghanistan and Iraq, knowing that there were medals in a box in the closet and pictures in a folder that was rarely opened. But he'd never really understood what that service meant in human terms. Today, he was beginning to understand. When his name was finally called, Jordan Marcus Wellington, graduating summa cum laude, recipient of the President's Award for Educational Excellence. The applause was thunderous. But what Jordan would remember wasn't the volume of the applause, it was the quality of it. It wasn't just celebration of his academic achievement, it was recognition of something larger. The son of a man who'd earned the respect of warriors, carrying that legacy forward into his own future. Jordan walked across the stage with his head high and his step steady. He shook hands with the principal, accepted his diploma, and turned toward the audience. His eyes found his father immediately. Marcus was standing now, applauding with the same quiet pride that had carried them both through 18 years of life together. But Jordan also saw the 6 men scattered throughout the gymnasium, all standing, all applauding, all clearly honoring not just his achievement, but his father's legacy. It was a moment of connection that transcended the ceremony itself, a bridge between generations of service and sacrifice. After the ceremony ended and the chaos of congratulations and photographs began to subside, Marcus found himself surrounded by people he hadn't expected to see. Blake Harrison was the first to approach, his familiar grin cutting through the years as if no time had passed at all. "Gunny," Blake said, using the old rank out of habit and affection. "Blake," Marcus replied, gripping his hand firmly. "I can't believe you're here." "Wouldn't have missed it," Blake said simply. Jordan's achievement is something worth celebrating. One by one, the others approached. Carlos Rivera, still built like the linebacker he'd been in high school, wrapped Marcus in a bear hug that lifted him off the ground. Samuel Brooks, more reserved but no less genuine, shook his hand and asked about his current assignment. Miguel Santos, David Chun, and the others, men who'd scattered across the country after their service ended, but had somehow all found their way to this small Texas gymnasium on this particular day. "How did you all know?" Marcus asked, still trying to process the coincidence. "We didn't," Carlos admitted. "I'm here because my nephew is graduating too. Saw the program online, saw Jordan's name, figured there couldn't be too many Wellingtons in this part of Texas." "Same here," Samuel added. "My partner's daughter is in this class. When I saw the name, I had to come see if it was really you." Similar stories emerged from each of them, coincidences and connections that had brought them all to the same place at the same time, just when Marcus needed them most. In the military, they would have called it divine providence. In civilian life, they just called it lucky. Jordan approached the group tentatively, still processing everything he'd witnessed. Marcus put an arm around his son's shoulders and began the introductions. "Jordan, these are some of the men I served with. Blake Harrison, Carlos Rivera, Samuel Brooks." Each name came with a brief story, a moment of shared history, a glimpse into the world his father had inhabited before Jordan was old enough to understand what any of it meant. "It's an honor to meet you all," Jordan said, and he meant it. These weren't just his father's old military buddies. These were the men who'd helped shape Marcus into the father Jordan had always known. Blake knelt down slightly to meet Jordan at eye level. "Your father never talked much about what we went through over there, did he?" Jordan shook his head. "That's because the important stuff wasn't what we did in combat," Blake continued. "It was what we learned about loyalty, about standing up for each other, about never leaving anyone behind. What you saw today, that wasn't about the military. That was about brotherhood. And now you're part of that legacy." As the crowd continued to thin and the afternoon sun slanted through the gymnasium windows, Marcus and Jordan found themselves walking toward the parking lot together. The Charger sat waiting under the Texas sun, still carrying the scent of Sarah's memory and the weight of 18 years of family history. "Dad," Jordan said as they reached the car, "I need to ask you something." Marcus nodded, leaning against the driver's side door. "Why didn't you say anything to those guards? I mean, you just sat there and let them. Why didn't you defend yourself?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the parking lot where other families were having their own conversations, making their own memories. "Son, there's something about dignity that most people don't understand. Real dignity doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to argue or justify or prove anything to anyone. It just is." He turned to face Jordan directly. "Those men who stood up today, they didn't do it because I asked them to. They didn't do it because they thought I couldn't handle myself. They did it because they recognized something that was bigger than just me being disrespected. They saw an injustice, and they chose to respond to it with strength and unity rather than anger and confrontation." Jordan nodded slowly, beginning to understand. Your whole life, you're going to encounter people who will try to make you smaller than you are. They'll do it with words, with actions, with systems and policies, and 1,000 subtle ways of suggesting that you don't belong where you are. And every time that happens, you'll have a choice. You can respond with anger, or you can respond with dignity. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out the worn photograph he'd carried throughout the ceremony. Jordan as a baby, cradled in Sarah's arms. "I carried this with me through 2 deployments, through losing your mother, and through today. Not because it gives me strength, but because it reminds me what I'm fighting for. Every time I've faced a challenge, every time someone has tried to diminish me or dismiss me, I remember that I'm not just representing myself. I'm representing your mother's memory, your future, and the example I want to set for the man you're becoming." Jordan took the photograph, studying the faces of his parents as young people, full of hopes and dreams that had led to this moment. "Those men in there today," Marcus continued, "they understand that some fights are worth having and some aren't. But when a fight is about principles, about respect, about standing up for what's right, that's when you discover who your real brothers are." As they drove away from Riverside High School, the building growing smaller in the rearview mirror, Marcus thought about the promises we make and the ways we keep them. He'd promised Sarah he'd be there for Jordan's graduation, and he'd kept that promise. But more than that, he'd shown his son what it looks like to face adversity with grace, to stand firm without standing alone, and to trust that integrity will always attract the kind of people worth knowing. Jordan sat quietly in the passenger seat, his diploma in his lap, his mind processing everything he'd witnessed and learned. In a few months, he'd be starting his freshman year at Texas A&M, beginning his own journey into adulthood. The challenges he'd face would be different from his father's, but the principles would be the same. Stand up for what's right, treat others with respect, and never forget that strength comes not from standing alone, but from knowing who will stand with you when it matters most. The sun was setting as they reached the outskirts of town, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, the highway stretched toward home, toward the future, toward all the moments still waiting to be lived and the lessons still waiting to be learned. Some stories end with dramatic confrontations and decisive victories. But the best stories, the ones that matter most, end with quiet moments of understanding, with wisdom passed from one generation to the next, and with the recognition that the most important battles are often won not through force, but through the simple act of refusing to be moved from where you belong. Marcus Wellington had come to watch his son graduate, and he'd done exactly that. But in the process, he'd also given Jordan and everyone else in that gymnasium something more valuable than any diploma, a masterclass in dignity, a demonstration of brotherhood, and a reminder that true strength is measured not by how loudly you can shout, but by how steadily you can stand when the world tries to shake you. The Charger carried them home through the Texas twilight, past fields and small towns, and all the quiet places where ordinary people live extraordinary lives. Behind them, the school grew smaller until it disappeared entirely. Ahead of them, the future waited with all its possibilities and challenges. And in the space between memory and hope, between the man Marcus had been and the man Jordan was becoming, the real graduation had already taken place, not with pomp and circumstance, but with the simple, profound recognition that some lessons can only be learned by watching how a good man handles himself when the world is watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded what true strength looks like. Because in a world that often mistakes volume for power, sometimes the most important voices are the ones that never need to raise themselves to be heard. This has been the Black Side Stories. Until next time, remember, behind every great achievement is someone who stood watch, someone who believed, someone who preserved what matters when no one else was looking.